for the next 30 minutes, we will be picking Chris's brain. There are a lot of immigration changes, a lot of new things that are coming up. There were a lot of nurses that were asking each other questions. Immigration is complicated, so we wanted to get some experts in here. And Chris, that's you. Okay, so let's go. Chris, we have a lot of questions. We know that there is a lot of concern and a lot of questions about NVC backlogs, EXPEDITE, a possible retrogression has everybody shaking. So I'm going to get right to all of the questions. Why is there a backlog at the NVC, and what is going on with this EXPEDITE process? Please fill us in.
Yeah, so there's a backlog at the NVC and at the Manila Embassy, essentially for one reason. And that one reason is the pandemic has led to massive staffing shortages at the Manila Embassy in particular, although frankly, there's shortages all around the world, Tanya. I saw a report actually just about an hour or two ago, and this is anecdotal, it's not necessarily factual, but there is at least one colleague of mine who is saying that while there are normally 75 interview windows in Manila, the average has only been about 3 being used. So you can just see it's dramatically a tight supply on these interviews. And so that's it. It's not that Tanya's doing anything wrong, or I'm doing anything wrong, or you, the nursing team, is doing anything wrong, or the U.S. hospitals and employers are doing anything wrong. It's really a staffing shortage. Now, to that end, Tanya and I actually participated on a call, I think that was Tuesday, Tanya.
Tuesday, yeah.
With about 15 or 20 industry leaders. And we spent all from 12 o'clock noon until about 5 o'clock, so about 5 hours.
Long day.
Hour, we would have a new call. And it was with U.S. congressional and Senate staffers. So the way the U.S. system works is we have 2 houses that run the Congress. We have a House of Representatives and a Senate. The Senate has 100 members. The House has, I think, 430 members. So it's a total of about 530 or so members. And each of those members have staffers underneath them. And almost all of them have an immigration staffer. And so the purpose of these roughly 15 or 20 meetings that we undertook that afternoon was to call attention to these problems at both Manila and around the world, these staffing shortages, and to try and work with this, to have the Congress put pressure on the embassies to come up with creative solutions. And this is a process that we've been ongoing. It takes a long time to set up one of these 5-hour meetings over and over again, 10 or so meetings. But we're making slow progress, I think. Obviously, getting a big bureaucracy like the U.S. federal government to do anything out of the ordinary is very difficult, but that doesn't mean people aren't trying. So I think the key messages here then, Tanya, are number one, the issues at both the NVC and the embassies are related to staffing shortages. It's not that the U.S. doesn't want the nurses, and it's not that there's anything flawed with any of the nursing petitions. It's nothing like that. It's simply staffing shortages related to COVID. That's number one. And number two, there is a conscientious ongoing effort of the leaders in this area. And I would include both Tanya and I on that small group of leaders who are working to try and get the U.S. embassies to work at a much higher capacity.
Yeah. Thank you for giving all that information, Chris, because I think that, for many nurses that are sitting outside the country who are trying to sending in expedite petitions, there's a lot of misinformation that happens about that. Some nurses are saying, oh, why, is it because of my employer? Maybe they don't have as much influence, or maybe my attorney's no good, or maybe the company, the recruitment company that I'm working with is not doing what's needed to be done. So you heard this from Chris directly, that is not the case. It's not that anybody's doing anything wrong. It's just a fact that the pandemic has created this staffing short. this shortage of staffing at the consulates.
And I'm sure what's very frustrating for the nurses who are listening in on this, Tanya, is that there are still a few windows open and a few cases are getting expedited. There does not seem to be much logic behind who gets expedited and who does not get expedited. And so it must be frustrating to find out that a colleague of yours, if you're a nurse, who maybe even started months after you, who maybe is even going to a smaller facility and maybe doesn't even have a bigger name recruiter working with them, and they get expedited and you don't. And I assure you that everyone is in the expedite queue, which essentially means nobody's in the expedite queue. And the State Department is more or less randomly choosing. And I think it just comes down to that they assign all the cases to those 75 officers, and only these 3 are working this week. And so anyone who has just happened to have been assigned to those 3, they actually get expedited, and the other 72 officers and all the cases beyond them don't get expedited, even though many of those are better cases or have been in process longer and are just as worthwhile to receive those visas.
Yeah. So please, if you're watching today, or if you have friends or relatives that are watching or that you want to share with, please share this information. It's not that somebody's doing anything wrong, or that why is that person getting ahead of the line and you aren't. It's just a basic fact of a shortage at the consulate. And just to share from my side, the discussions that Chris was speaking about on Tuesday was under the umbrella of the AAIHR. So that's important also for people to know. The AAIHR is very active and very involved in the lobbying government to try and expedite cases. I think it was a really good series of meetings. It was quite exhausting. I think at the end of the day, Chris was certainly exhausted from talking, as were all of the members of the AAIHR. But hopefully, slowly, there will be a progression. So there's a lot of work that's going on behind the scenes that nurses might not realize. Okay, so we've got a lot of, oh my goodness, we've got a lot of people joining us. We've got Jane who's joining us. We've got Luster from the Philippines. Kate is saying hi from Manila. Carl Camille from the UAE. Anne from Riyadh. Hi, Anne. We've got Jovelyn, Ron. Lots of people watching from all over. I'm going to try to get through as many questions as possible. John asks an interesting question, Chris. Why don't they increase their staff then?
Believe me, we asked this question too, John. Tanya and I did on Tuesday. We've suggested a number of suggestions to them. One is the very obvious one that John brings up, which is in my mind the right answer, or at least a right answer, which is just increase your staffing. Number 2, we have tried to suggest them that they do some sort of virtual interviews. Now, they will say that the law requires them to do in-person interviews. I'm not so sure they're correct on that opinion, but even if they're not, I'm not so sure they can't do a hybrid of an in-person and a video interview, for instance, where they would do a video interview, but then maybe have the person come in and actually pick up their visa. So I think that's just posturing by the State Department. We've also suggested group live interviews. So for instance, all of Tanya's nurses would come in on a Monday, and all of some other hospitals' nurses would come in on a Tuesday, and some other company would come in on a Wednesday, so that the officers do not have to keep reviewing the same information about the U.S. employer over and over again, which seems to me like a colossal waste of time. So yeah, John, that's a terrific idea. And again, we've got a number of ideas that we're suggesting to the State Department, some even that are probably not appropriate for this forum, but are even more creative legally. But yes, I think just staffing up the agency. I mean, one of the messages that Tanya and I and the rest of the AAIHR were consistent on Tuesday was that we're really asking the State Department to recognize that this pandemic is probably the new normal for at least a while. And so the answer can't end with the pandemic means we have a staffing shortage. Our message to the State Department is other businesses, other facilities, hospitals have been getting into telemedicine. Tanya, I'm sure 2 years ago would have not believed she does as much recruiting over things like Zoom. I cannot believe how much more work we do video and remote than I ever would have thought a couple of years ago. And so our message to the State Department is the State Department also has to adopt to the current situation, which is a pandemic. They have to adapt more video technologies. They have to adapt, group interviews. They have to do things to accept the fact that the answer can't just be we can only have 3 people work at a time because of the pandemic. That's not going to get it done.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so I see there's a question from Cynic, I hope I pronounced that right, asking, I want to ask why the other countries can easily give ID like in Singapore, Oman, or Qatar. So Chris, what you'd said is that this is a random thing, right?
Yeah, I think other countries, especially when they're smaller like Qatar or Singapore, they just don't have the bureaucracy that America has. I think that's one thing. So they're more nimble. I'm sure that's the case. I think the U.S. has an immigration situation that's a little more complex than Singapore and places like Qatar, including the U.S. system tends to be when you come here, you are ultimately on a path to being a full U.S. citizen. And so the screening requirements are maybe higher than in places like Qatar. And I'm not an expert on all countries' immigration. My impression in places like Qatar, for instance, is that someone who immigrates to Qatar is never going to eventually get Qatarian citizenship, if indeed that's the right word. So it's a different immigration goal. Qatar's real goal is to bring nurses in, work them in the hospitals, and then frankly to have them leave at some point. Whereas the U.S. system is much more inclusive, which is why we allowed in Tanya 20 years ago. And
21 years ago.
Many years ago.
Proud citizen, Chris.
Proud citizen as well, yeah.
Chris, I think that Zinnik was talking about why are the consulates in Singapore, Oman, or Qatar getting nurses through quicker. I think that's what that question.
Yeah, I think that they're just more efficient at doing their job, and frankly, just have far smaller demand. I don't know what the Qatar number is, but I would bet it's less than 5%, maybe 1% of the amount of visas that America processes, and so it's just a much smaller.
It's one embassy.
Yeah, it's if you think about it, if it's a large traffic jam, you might get faster using a bicycle, but in the long run, you're probably better off using a car or a truck. And so America is this car or this truck, whereas Qatar is a bicycle.
Okay. Got it. Okay, so moving on to the next hot topic. This is one that has everybody that sees the word shaking in their boots. So we have a question from Brenz. We have a question from Wing. We have a question from Allison. We have a question from Jeff Ray. We have a question from Diana. Same question coming up again and again. Retrogression. If retrogression will happen by November, what does this mean?
Right. So, the State Department, they actually had a video that you can watch. It was released maybe Tuesday or Wednesday.
Yeah.
If you Google YouTube, Charlie Oppenheim, not Charlie Oppenheimer, the State Department, they do a monthly video. I watched it earlier this week. The information that we're getting from Charlie seems a little bit inconsistent, which is a shame because traditionally he's done a good job. And Charlie has been running the State Department's visa bulletin for, at least 15 or so years, maybe even longer than that. And so he does understand this stuff quite well. But what he has explained is that there's essentially 2 ways that one can get a green card, or at least an employment-based green card. One is to do it domestically here in the United States, and that's if you're in the United States, maybe on a student visa or an H-1 visa or some other visa. That's called adjustment of status. And there's a second way, which is the way most of the nurses come in. Indeed, almost all the Filipino nurses come into the U.S., and that's through the consular processing. And so the issue here is that the green cards that are being processed here in the United States, there has been no fall off. They are still being processed at the same rate. In fact, actually the fastest rate in about 15 years I've seen. So the visas are being used here domestically, but as we all know, overseas with the shortages at the embassy, they're very, very light at the embassy. And so if the State Department puts in retrogression in November, which is what the visa bulletin that came out implied, the goal there is actually to make sure that all the visas are not used domestically here. And so actually, believe it or not, and it's counterintuitive, but a retrogression for Philippine EB3 is actually to the benefit of many people on this call. And the reason is because we will be essentially, new green cards that are filed here in the United States will not be able to get their visas, therefore keeping visas on reserve for Philippines with priority dates of 2018, 2019, 2020. So that's the goal. It's to essentially make sure that there are plenty of visas on reserve for the consular processes. That's one explanation that Charlie's giving. A second explanation that Charlie's giving is that the demand for visas has been higher than he expected. And so therefore, more visas are being claimed than he expected. I certainly accept that as an answer from Charlie. I think he's being truthful. It is a little disconcerting that 30 days ago, he had no idea this was happening. And now 30 days later, it's been this dramatic. And he's pointing to filings that happened last October. So the information we're getting out of him, I don't want to say it's inconsistent, but it is concerning that the information changes so dramatically. He also, at least once or twice in that video, implied that while he expects there to be a retrogression in November, he didn't really say how long it would be for either the worldwide EB3 or the Philippine EB3. He half implied that it might only be until something like January. So those are some negative factors because of the lack of information. On the positive side, he seemed to imply that he expected that the embassies would be coming online and processing a lot faster in the forthcoming months, which is ultimately the best news for everybody who's on this video, Tanya.
Okay. So, Chris, that's a lot of information and a lot of different
complicated issue. Yeah.
Yes. What for any nurse who's in the Philippines right now or in the UAE right now, what is their takeaway from this change on the visa bulletin and the possible retrogression?
Yeah, that's a good question, a good way to think about it, Tanya. I think the first thing is there's nothing anyone can do about it. So worrying, getting nervous, even complaining over it doesn't do any good. It's ephemeral and it doesn't really help. So that's the first thing. Getting educated, maybe watching the video that I'm suggesting. If you're really that curious, it's only about 40 minutes long. And so you'll have the latest information from this week. I think that's a productive use of people's times, Tanya. I think those are the most important things. I also think the reality is there are a lot of visas in there that are available, and there continue to be a lot of visas available. And it's changing quite quickly, as we can tell. I mean, just 30 days ago, there was no hint that this retrogression was coming. And now all of a sudden, oh my goodness, retrogression is coming. So I think it could change again. But really what we need to hope for is that the Manila embassy gets open and starts processing cases, because that ultimately is the answer. It doesn't really do any good if the visa bulletin is current or if the visa bulletin gets backlogged 20 years. If the embassy can't process visas, then we're all stuck.
Mm-hmm. Okay. All right. So I think the big message is for everybody not to panic, because it is, as Chris said, out of our control. And I think probably it's also a little bit of, I mean, even for me, Chris, like that post-traumatic stress of what happened in 2019 or even in, I think it was late 2008 and late 2019 with the retrogression. And people just hear that word and it just gets very scary. So there's a question here that comes from Ida. Can my case be still filed for a new petition if there's a retrogression?
I'm not sure I understand. She wants to refile if there's
she wants to file a new case. Can a new case?
Meaning with a new employer.
Correct. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, she should check with the new. Well, the first thing I always counsel on this, Tanya, is why are you leaving your first employer? You will want to, most importantly, make sure that you're not violating a contract, which can be very costly and very problematic. Assuming that's not a problem, then yes, you can recapture a priority date. So if you have company A with a, I don't know, 2019 priority date, and company A tells you we no longer need you or want you to come to the US. If you file for company B and it's done the correct way, even though you file for company B in September of 2021, your I-140 approval notice will be backdated back to 2019, which will at least put you in the retrogression queue from 2019 and not 2021.
Okay, but I think the bottom line, Chris, is that I've got a lot of questions from nurses as well, just saying, I've just passed my NCLEX, can my case be filed even if there's a retrogression?
Oh, yes, absolutely.
Okay, so that's good for everybody to know. We're also getting a lot of questions here, Amy, Patricia, Maria, about the vaccine mandate. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, no, it's a good question and very timely. So starting October 1st, all immigrants into the United States will have to be vaccinated. They already have to be vaccinated, Tanya, for a number of communicable diseases like the measles and the mumps and a few others. And those are done through the regular immigration process when you go to your medicals a few weeks before your visa appointment. And now on the list will also be a COVID vaccine. And if you have not been immunized, I think you have to have the first step at least done. A lot of the vaccines, at least the one that I took, required a shot and then another shot a few weeks later. So yeah, you will have to be vaccinated. If you're not vaccinated, you will not be able to attend your interview, and therefore you cannot get your green card.
Okay, so I think very straightforward on that. Okay, so let's go to a few specific questions. I'm going to try and get through as many of these as possible. So Idea asks, I'm American citizen from California, petitioned my husband via I-130. How long will it take, and what is the next step?
Depends if your husband's a U.S. citizen or a U.S. permanent resident.
She doesn't say.
Yeah. So if your husband is a U.S., I mean, I have to look. I don't have the dates for that.
I think she's a U.S. citizen who's petitioned her husband, right?
She's a U.S. citizen. Yeah. Okay,
yeah.
So what she wants to do is she wants to go to the visa bulletin, and she will see that U.S. citizens can sponsor for their families outside of the visa bulletin. It's what we call being immediately eligible. If she's a U.S. permanent resident, then she would go to the visa bulletin and she would look at F2A is the category, which is current. So that's good news. So they would both be current. And then really it's just a question of the I-130 has to get filed here in the United States. That can take maybe 6 to 9 months, something like that. And then you go through the NVC process just like any other nurse, Tanya. And unfortunately, right now, as many of the nurses have raised in the questions and are seeing personally, it's impossible to say how long it will take the embassy to schedule you for a visa. So
because of the staffing issues.
Yeah.
Okay, we have a question from Honey. Honey says, I'm a Canadian citizen. I have an active application for an EB3 in the NVC. Is it okay if I applied for TN visa as of the moment while waiting for the ID? Will it not affect my EB3 application, or just wait for the ID before planning to work in the US?
Yeah, so the first thing I would do is I would talk to my employer and my immigration attorney, because anything that's this specific, I always hesitate to give advice over a video like this, because there could be things that I don't know about, including your hospital may not, even though they have a slot for you, maybe they don't want you to start for a week or 2 or 5 weeks for whatever reason. That maybe they have an onboarding program and they want. So unquestionably, number one is don't do anything yourself. Talk to your U.S. employer, talk to your immigration attorney. Having said that, as a general rule of thumb, you can attempt to file for a TN, which the filing just happens at the border. The U.S. officer is going to be concerned about something called your intent, your immigration intent. And so the officer may deny you because you have a green card pending. If it's structured properly and you have a good attorney who's working on it, you can get coached and structured in a way so that you can enter the United States on a TN and then exit the United States and head to, I'm presuming, Canada, Montreal. Vancouver may do these as well, but I know Montreal does, where you will actually go through your green card appointment many months from now when your date becomes available. The immigration officers at the airports and the ports of entry sometimes don't understand this, which is why I'm really cautioning you to talk to your immigration attorney. Unfortunately, some immigration attorneys who don't practice in this space very long sometimes are a little mistaken about this. And so hopefully you have a good immigration attorney who can help coach you through this issue. What's always concerning is you do not want to get turned down at the border, which is why I think it's so critical that you do not do this on your own, that you talk to your employer and talk to your immigration attorney. But again, the general answer, and again, I'm speaking generally, is that this can be done. It just has to be structured properly.
Okay, and that's where hopefully you've got a good lawyer who's helping you with that, honey. And honey, also just to mention to you, next Friday, we will be doing an entire show on the Connetics USA Facebook page called Onwards and Upwards. And the topic for next Friday is the TN visa and all the implications for TN, for nurses, for Canadian citizens. So please feel free to come and watch that, and anybody else who's watching. Christian is asking, Chris, I am a multiple US tourist visa, and I have an EB3 petition. Can I just go to the US using my tourist visa and convert or process it there?
No. So you cannot do that. That's a violation of immigration law. And it's actually a little bit like the TN question we have with, so you're allowed to attempt to enter the United States as a tourist. The border officer or the port of entry airport officer is going to have two pretty good questions for you that I think are going to be difficult for you to answer. Number one, if your plan is to come to the United States and adjust your status here in the United States, that's actually a reason for them to bar you from entering the United States. So if that's your intent and you miss, so that's one problem. If you lie to the officer and tell him that you don't intend to have your green card adjusted in the United States, now you're committing immigration fraud, which is a much bigger issue. The third question the immigration officer is going to want to know is, what are you going to do in the United States for what could be months and maybe even a year until your green card is approved? They're going to want to know how you're going to be able to support yourself, because you're not eligible to work on a tourist visa. And so the next piece is the immigration officer is going to be concerned that you're going to be working illegal in the United States. So for all of those reasons, that's not a good idea.
Big no.
Big no. Now, if you wanted to come to the United States to go to San Diego and visit Tanya and have her take you to the beach for a week, and then you plan on going back to the Philippines
for a visit,
that's probably a different story. Yeah. But you can't come here intending to work or intending to adjust your status.
And that's what I love about this show, Friday Facebook Live with the legal experts, because that's where somebody could really make a terrible mistake not hearing it from the experts like Chris of what to do and what not to do. And we have a question from Cindy. Hi, everybody. I have a question. I'm already here in the US since August 3rd as an EB3 visa. My dependents are followed to join. The US Embassy still has no reply and their papers have not started yet. Would it be affected by the retrogression if this happens? There are a lot of people asking this question, Chris.
I'm not sure I followed the question, actually, Tanya.
I think the question is that she's here. So she's
in the United States.
She's in the US and her dependents are in Manila. So they did the follow to join process. Yeah. And will they be affected by the retrogression? So they obviously waiting for the Manila consulate right now.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I don't know if they'll be affected by the retrogression because we don't know what the retrogression is going to be, right? So if the retrogression that will come out, first of all, will not be effective until November 1st. Probably in about 30 days, we will get the November visa bulletin, which will answer some questions. So that's number one. But number two, their priority date will still control, which is, I think, what she's probably getting at. Yeah. And so if the retrogression is, and this is just an example, I'm not saying this is what's going to happen. If the retrogression is January 1st, 2021, and your family members and your priority date are from 2020 or before that, then they will not be affected by the retrogression. But if the retrogression is January 1st, 2021, and again, that's a made up number, I have no information on it, and your family's priority date and your priority date is May of 2021, then of course they will not be eligible for their green card.
Okay. So Chris, I'd like to clarify this because I see there's a lot of questions coming through about it. If the retrogression comes in and starts, for example, and just saying November 1st, right? If somebody is already in line, if they're already in the green card process, right? So they've done a consular green card and they've got a priority date, that is earlier than that time frame, will their case continue as is normally, right?
Yes.
So the retrogression is only going to affect those people that are filed from November onwards, correct?
No. Sorry.
Okay.
So think of it this way.
Okay.
So I think it's helpful to think of it, to talk about it less abstractly and to try and give a concrete example.
Okay.
So let's pretend on the November visa bulletin, the Philippine EB3 priority visa bulletin date is January 1st, 2021.
Okay.
And again, I know I've said it a few times,
Yeah.
but I'm just making that date up.
Yeah. For everybody, it's clear. It's a made up date.
I have no idea if that's
Nobody needs to panic.
or even if there's going to be. But if it is January 1st, 2021, if you have a priority date that is December 31st, 2020 or earlier, your case will just move through normally without any impediment at all.
Okay.
If your priority date is January 1st or more recent, over the last 9 months or so, then no matter where your case is in the NVC process, your case freezes until such time as the priority date moves forward again beyond your priority date. And so it does not just affect cases that are filed in November. It affects cases filed January 1st, 2021 or forward.
Okay, got it. Okay, so that was a good clarification for many people. I'm going to take, we're actually out of time, but I'm going to take one more question. Let me see, which is a question that a lot of people, there's some that are very specific here. And thank you, Chris. Also, everybody who's watching, Chris has agreed that he will go into the chat afterwards and will answer any specific questions as best as he can, if we were not able to get them in the show. But let me just see if there's one. Oh, here's a question, which is kind of an interesting question. We've actually had 2 people ask this question. Is it possible to have the medical and interview in the US or in its US territories, for example, Guam, if the applicant is under consular processing?
No, you normally have to get the medical in the same jurisdiction as your embassy appointment.
Okay, well, that answers that question. Okay, well, I've tried to get through as many as I can. Thank you, Chris, so much for joining us today. And thank you for agreeing to just go into the chat and to answer any specific questions we didn't get to. Thank you again to the Lafora admin team for giving us this opportunity. Chris, I know that there are so many people all over the world that are so grateful to you right now, not just for all the work, the wonderful work that you do, but also for giving your time right now, because there's a lot of fear, there's a lot of worry, there's a lot of concern specifically about the expedite process and retrogression. So hopefully we've shed some light on that. Obviously, this panel doesn't have all of the answers because it's not something that's in our control, but hopefully it will shed some light. And I wanted to also just point everybody to, I think it was Marion, who gave a lovely post here into, I'm just looking for it, Marion, who gave a lovely post here into the chat, he's already in the US, and he's saying to everybody, don't lose hope, don't give up. This is going to happen. It just, sometimes there are setbacks and things that we don't expect. So just hang in there, and hopefully we'll have more information for you at the next Friday Facebook Live with the legal experts. Thank you so much, Chris. Thank you to everybody who's joining us.
Yeah, and thank you to all the folks who are listening in. And I'm sure it's frustrating, and but America does need you, and they want you, and we're flawed, and the bureaucracy is frustrating, but don't lose hope.
Don't lose hope is the message. And for those of you that still want to come to America and have not yet passed the NCLEX exam, please continue on that route, because hopefully these are temporary setbacks. As Chris said, there is enormous demand for international nurses. I've been doing this for 15 years. Chris, I think you've been doing it for even longer. And I can tell you there's more demand for international nurses right now than has ever been in the US. So please don't give up that hope, and we continue the journey. Thank you, everybody. Thank you for joining us, Chris.
Bye-bye, everyone.